All right, last thing we want to talk about on this debut show. Chicago Bears wound up with the number 1 pick somehow. Houston shot themselves in the foot again and took themselves out of it. So whether or not they end up back with it with a trade or whatever, Chicago now has all the leverage. They're sitting there at number 1. They get to determine how this draft is going to start, how it's going to go. And obviously the most important element there is Justin Fields. They theoretically already have a quarterback, a guy that was taken in the first round, a guy that a lot of people loved in that draft. Remember, you don't have to go back that far before people were sort of flipping a coin between Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. And then it became Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson, number 1, 2, very quickly for some reason. And Fields started to slide, and evidently the NFL liked him a lot less than some other people, or at least some did. So I guess the question initially is, what did the Bears learn from Justin Fields this year?
That he is a special runner, that an offense predicated around his legs can be an effective offense in the NFL. Because, I mean, it was him, right? He didn't have a good receiving core, didn't have much of an offensive line. For them to even be an average offense like they were this year was just him. Like, it was just him elevating below average personnel to an average offense. So that's good. Good starting point. Don't think we learned anything about him as a passer.
Right.
Which sucks to say because it's kind of what everyone said pre-season where, hey, they didn't do enough for wide receiver. They didn't do enough at offensive line to really properly evaluate him. And you didn't. You had guys like, Equanimeous St. Brown out there as his primary options at points during the season, which is just I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're Tom Brady in his prime. It's difficult to win.
I mean, we've seen it with Tom Brady in his prime. Like,
yeah.
No, but I mean,
that
we've
way,
seen, right? Like, we've
exactly.
seen when you take away any viable receiver, all of a sudden Tom Brady in his prime, which admittedly was like 40 at that point, still looked bad. Like Tom Brady.
2012, when he first called it, was when he had not a lot, and it was going south. So I do think that's the worry if you are the Bears going forward, is that, there's a lot of excuses you can make about him, and they're all valid. They are valid excuses. But it doesn't mean that when the situation will be good, that he all of a sudden will be as well.
Yeah.
So that's what you're scared of.
It's difficult because you're right. Exactly what everybody said was a concern, that after a year, you're not going to know any more about him as a passer, which is, I mean, it's the important part, right? Like, whatever about what he brings as a running threat, that kind of buys you some time. But if he can't get any better as a passer, it's not going to fly. So that element remains a question mark, entirely because they dismantled the team around him and didn't do anything to rebuild it back. So they've basically just wasted a year of understanding what he is, to the point where now, if you do care about rookie contract value and all that kind of stuff, it's a valid conversation to have about, well, 50% of this guy's rookie contract is done now.
Yeah.
And we happen to be sitting here at the number 1 overall pick. How good is Bryce Young or Will Levis or whoever you like? Because you're not comparing him like, how good is he versus Justin Fields 2 years ago? You're like, how good is he versus Justin Fields minus 50% of his contract and with this unknown as a passer?
I think that is much more of a debate in the Bears front office right now that Brian Poles is having than any Bears fan wants to admit.
It should be, right? I mean, it's only due diligence to do that.
Because that what you just hit the nail on the head is that you're kind of, even as just a franchise, you're coming into like a window. You have $100 million cap space. You have this draft capital. You're coming into, if you make good decisions with that money of cap space, with those draft picks, this is a Super Bowl team quickly, sort of thing. Like that's just how the NFL works. It ebbs and flows. Rosters, get torn down, built back up, to where this is it. Next 3 years is going to be very important. That is extended. That window gets extended if you have a Bryce Young in the fold, where you have 5 years of that now,
right,
where it gets extended to. Whereas with Justin Fields in the fold, it's only 3 years. And you can get, if you can get a king's ransom for the number 1 overall pick, I still think maybe I'd lean towards going that route, because Justin Fields is that special as a runner, and you don't necessarily have to worry about the long-term viability of an offense with a running quarterback, because it's just a rookie deal. You don't necessarily have to make a long-term play right now. You just have to win the next 3 seasons when he's cheap. So I think it's a viable debate that would not surprise me if Ryan Poles ends up on the, hey, let's draft Bryce Young side of it, because Bryce Young's that good, and because they're in that kind of position as a franchise to open up a big window if you hit on a guy like Bryce Young that wouldn't necessarily be as big if you just have a Justin Fields.
Because that's the key, right? Is that there's two sides to it. There's where are we on Justin Fields, which is its own conversation. And then there's how good is Bryce Young? Because I don't like Steve Keim in Arizona made an absolute ton of mistakes down the years. But one thing I don't think they get enough credit for is abandoning Josh Rosen and drafting Kyler Murray when they did. Like, I don't think that was the slam dunk that a lot of people said it was in terms of like institutional NFL actions. Like, that is not something that the NFL does very often. Walk away from the dude we sunk resources into a year ago with a first-round draft pick, and the very next year draft the guy all over again just because we think he's that much better. So I give them a ton of credit for doing that. But the only reason they did is because they're like, oh, the difference between Rosen as a prospect and Kyler Murray as a prospect is huge. Like, getting this chance is not going to come around very often. So we got to jump on it while it's there, even if it means we're burning the guy we drafted a year ago. So a lot of that comes down to where you rank Bryce Young, in this pantheon of quarterback prospects over the last however many years versus the Trevor Lawrences, the Joe Burrows, the Baker Mayfields, or whatever it looked like where you stack him up in that whole group, I think is a big part of determining whether you make this move or not.
Yeah, and as much as you can love Justin Fields, and believe in Justin Fields, they still finished with the worst record in the NFL this season, and he only passed for 149 yards a game when he was a starter. It's like those two things are difficult to really square with Bears fans' feelings about Justin Fields and how good he's going to be in the future. It's like even like Jalen Hurts last year, where everyone's comparing now Justin Fields to Jalen Hurts' year 2 to Josh Allen's year 2 where it was bad. Jalen Hurts had 3,400 yards, 1,200 more yards than Justin Fields. They made the playoffs, with Justin Hurts. Like, there's a lot of differences still that you have to kind of overlook to go to bat that heavily for Justin
Fields. It's fascinating, though, the player that he has kind of become right now, because obviously everybody knew he was athletic coming out and he had speed, but nobody knew he was going to break Lamar Jackson records for rushing in a single season.
Because no one used him like that.
Right.
Yeah.
But even so, again, it's like, yeah, even if you sort of change the usage, you're like, sure, he's effective, he's a rusher, but just how dynamic and how special he is with the ball in his hands seems crazy based off what we thought about him as a prospect. Like, he is on that Lamar Jackson level of this is freakish ability. And what that does, though, is I think buys you a lot of time for him to get better as a passer, but that doesn't factor in the contract. It's like, that's the bit to me that's a little bit like Jalen Hurts, which is if you didn't have that rushing ability, he would not, I don't think he'd be the quarterback anymore. Like, he just wouldn't, he wouldn't have made it to the year where he broke out to be that passer. If Justin Fields didn't have what he has as a runner right now, it wouldn't even be a conversation. Again, they'd have benched him for Trevor Siemian or whatever halfway through the year. The fact that he's this special buys you enough time to be like, well, all right, what happens if we give him some receivers and some, viable actual offense? Yeah. How much better can we make him immediately? And even if it isn't much, the defense stinks, right? If we make that better, we had the 20 whatever ranked offense, just him playing at this level is enough for an average offense. If we build around him, how much better can that get? And then even the only downside of that is you would be passing up the chance at Bryce Young. But in theory, if you decided to start building around Justin Fields now and it didn't work out, you could still go get a quarterback next year. It would just be harder because you probably don't have the same draft position.
Yeah. And if you are to go, if they are going to go in at Justin Fields, if they do move the number 1 overall pick, go back, you have to, this offseason, no excuses. You have to give them no excuses, right? You have to build up the offensive line through free agency as much as humanly possible. You have to get vertical threats in the passing game. A successful Justin Fields passing offense, knowing kind of what we know about him, is going to be predicated on big plays. It just is. It's going to be predicated on, he's not a Daniel Jones, let's move 7-8 yards down the football field at a time. That's not who he is. It is going to be a, let's get Darnell Mooney, let's get Chase Claypool, and let's get, say, a Jalen Hyatt out of Tennessee, a 4-3 guy who at all three of them can get vertical at any point in time, and Justin Fields is going to hit you over the top when you bring that extra guy in the box. That's what it has to look like next year, or else I think Ryan Poles has failed to put him in a position to succeed here.
Yeah, and I hope that they don't let the kind of what I would term at this point sunk capital on Chase Claypool, adjust.
Stop you from
doing anything like that. At this point, you just have to treat that as basically a wasted draft pick. We goofed. We took a risk. I mean, I didn't love the capital, but I kind of understood the gamble that they wanted to take on him. But at this point, it's like, it didn't work. Forget it. Move on. Like, find anything else. And if he's still on the roster, fine. But like, don't act like, well, we gave him the number 32 overall pick. How come he's not doing anything?
Yeah, he's got to be your number 2.
Right. So bottom line on this, you would draft Bryce Young?
I'd draft Bryce Young. He's fucking good, man. He's good. He's good. And I do think Phil's still, like, you don't have to start Bryce Young right away. You know, I think there's a world where they can be on the same roster next season.
Oh, wow. So I'm not, okay. The thing that I think that the Eagles did that was smartest when they essentially hedged with Jalen Hurts at quarterback is they made sure to keep kicking capital into the next year so that if it didn't go well, you still had 2 first-round draft picks next year, which could let you get towards the draft pick to get the quarterback if you needed one. Like, you're not relying on just being terrible next year. So if the Bears trade out of that number 1 overall pick, if they get a draft haul, I would absolutely ensure that haul involved a number 1 pick next year, so that if the Fields thing doesn't work out, you use that draft capital to build around him. But if Fields doesn't work out, you've got 2 firsts next year, so that wherever you end up, if you're picking 15 instead of 1, you've got a shot of going into the top 5 to go get your quarterback.
And shit, whoever's going to give you that future 1 may not be good.
Right.
If it's Colts, if it's Panthers.
And that's the thing.
Whoever it is.
The Colts
could be the one,
The Colts have, like, Mark written all over them, don't they, coming into this draft? It's like, that they don't want to go after Derek Carr. Yeah. They don't want a veteran. They've just swung at the veterans multiple times, failed every time. They're sitting at 4. They probably know the Texans don't want to trade with them. They've got, like, sucker. Right?
They are what the Jets were, right, in 2018 when they flipped back with the Jets. The Jets were like, everyone's like, oh, the Jets, they have to get Sam Darnold. They have to go get a quarterback. That's the inverse now, unfortunately.
By the way, somebody reminded me recently. Remember when it was just a fascinating what if of, like, the last few years, and in particular with the Eagles, because I love almost everything they've done as a team building enterprise. I think almost every move, even if it didn't work out, has been structurally sound process-wise. Remember there was a report that the Eagles wanted to trade up to number 2, to number 3, but only if they could get Zach Wilson. Yeah. But once it became clear that the Jets had dialed in on Zach Wilson as number 2, the Eagles were basically out of the trading up game or out of the quarterback market, settled with what they had, and all of a sudden they've built like a Super Bowl caliber roster because of it. But like, just the Jets essentially determining that they like Zach Wilson potentially save Philadelphia from drafting that guy and being saddled with a disaster at quarterback, assuming it would have worked out the same.
That's why the draft's the best. This is it. The decisions, those 3 days.
All right.
Super Bowls.